The global narrative regarding Africa is consistently framed through the lens of scarcity and humanitarian desperation. We are conditioned by decades of media imagery to perceive the continent as a perpetual beneficiary of Western altruism, a place defined by its need for aid, infrastructure, and basic survival. However, when we move beneath the surface of these charitable campaigns and examine the raw financial data, a staggering paradox emerges that contradicts everything we are told. Africa is the most resource-rich landmass on the planet, possessing 30% of the world's remaining mineral reserves, including the vast majority of the cobalt, platinum, and diamonds essential for modern technology. Yet, it remains the poorest continent by almost every economic metric. This discrepancy is not a historical accident nor a simple byproduct of internal mismanagement. While the world sends roughly $30 billion in development aid to Africa every year, the continent loses significantly more through a sophisticated network of financial conduits. Reports indicate that over $80 billion are drained from African nations annually through a combination of illicit financial flows, predatory lending, and industrial-scale tax avoidance. This means that, in purely mathematical terms, the rest of the world is a net debtor to Africa. The continent is not being helped. It is being harvested. To understand why this cycle persists, we must look past the visible corruption of local officials and investigate the invisible architecture of the global banking system. We are not looking at a broken system, but one that is functioning exactly as it was designed to. In this investigation, we will deconstruct the hidden mechanisms that maintain this structural poverty. We will expose the technical traps used by multinational entities to bypass national sovereignty. If you seek to understand the cold reality of global power dynamics, subscribe to Beneath the Numbers and activate all notifications. To comprehend the stagnation of African economies, we must move beyond the superficial explanations of corruption and civil unrest. While these factors are real, they're often the symptoms of a much deeper systemic pathology. Our framework for this analysis is built upon the concept of the structural extraction trap. This is a multi-layered economic environment where African nations are integrated into the global market not as competitive partners, but as primary resource providers with zero pricing power. This trap is maintained through three primary pillars: monetary dependency, trade barriers designed to prevent industrialization, and a legal framework that prioritizes the rights of foreign capital over the fiscal health of the state. We will demonstrate how the current international financial architecture creates a resource curse that is actually an engineered outcome. By keeping African nations locked in the lower tiers of the value chain, the system ensures a steady flow of cheap raw materials to the industrialized North while preventing the accumulation of domestic capital. This is a story of legalistic theft, where complex accounting maneuvers and international treaties do more damage than any local dictator ever could. We are investigating the math of exploitation, where the numbers reveal a deliberate design to keep a continent in a state of managed underdevelopment. The primary mechanism through which wealth is extracted from the African continent is not through overt theft, but through the sophisticated application of trade misinvoicing and transfer pricing. This is a legalistic maneuver used by multinational corporations to shift profits from high-tax or resource-rich jurisdictions to low-tax offshore financial centers. To understand the operational flow, imagine a mining conglomerate extracting copper in Zambia. Instead of selling the copper directly to the global market at its true value, the local subsidiary sells the raw material at an artificially low price to another subsidiary of the same parent company, located in a tax haven like Mauritius or the British Virgin Islands. On paper, the Zambian operation shows little to no profit, thereby paying minimal local taxes, while the offshore entity resells the same copper to the final buyer at the actual market price, capturing the entire profit margin in a jurisdiction where it is untaxed. This process, known as transfer pricing manipulation, accounts for a massive portion of the $88 billion lost annually. The technical complexity of these transactions makes them nearly impossible for underfunded African revenue authorities to audit effectively. A single shipment of minerals might be sold through 5 different shell companies across 3 continents before the physical product even reaches its destination. Each layer of the transaction adds a degree of opacity, designed specifically to erode the tax base of the exporting nation. The systemic implication is a permanent state of fiscal insolvency for African governments. While they provide the infrastructure, labor, and natural resources for global industry, they are systematically denied the tax revenue required to fund their own development. Furthermore, the role of global accounting firms and international banks cannot be overlooked in this architectural drain. These entities provide the financial engineering necessary to create these opaque structures, often operating within the technical boundaries of international law while violating the economic sovereignty of the host nations. When a multinational corporation uses these tactics, it isn't just avoiding tax. It is effectively stripping the state of the capital necessary for public investment. This results in a feedback loop where African nations must then borrow money from the very same international financial markets that are hosting their stolen capital, often at predatory interest rates. The numbers reveal a cold reality. The capital leaving the continent through these illicit and semi-legal channels dwarfs the total amount of foreign aid and investment entering it, making the continent a silent donor to the global financial elite. The second pillar of the structural extraction trap is the lack of monetary sovereignty, most visible in the enduring legacy of the CFA Franc. Used by 14 nations in West and Central Africa, this currency is a direct remnant of the French colonial era, and its technical structure is designed to prioritize stability for foreign investors over the industrial growth of the member states. At its core, the CFA franc is pegged to the euro, a mechanism that provides a stable exchange rate but strips African central banks of their most powerful economic tool, the ability to adjust the value of their own currency to reflect their economic realities. Because the currency is artificially hard, it makes African exports more expensive on the global market, while making imports from Europe cheaper, effectively subsidizing foreign manufactured goods at the expense of local industrialization. The operational control of this system is even more restrictive. For decades, the technical rules of the CFA zone required member nations to deposit a significant portion, at times up to 65%, of their foreign exchange reserves directly into an operations account controlled by the French Treasury. While recent reforms have aimed to change the branding of this relationship, the underlying systemic architecture remains one of dependency. By controlling these reserves, the French Treasury effectively guarantees the convertibility of the currency. But in exchange, African nations lose the ability to use their own wealth to stimulate domestic credit or invest in large-scale infrastructure projects. This creates a ceiling on growth. Without the power to manage their own money supply or interest rates, these nations are unable to implement the sovereign monetary policies that every developed nation used to industrialize. The implications of this monetary arrangement are profound and systemic. In a standard economy, a period of low growth would be met with a devaluation of the currency to make exports more competitive and stimulate local production. In the CFA zone, this is impossible. The fixed peg ensures that these nations remain locked into a high-cost environment that favors the extraction of raw materials by foreign firms who want a stable environment to repatriate their profits. It is a system that enforces macroeconomic stability at the cost of economic development. The CFA franc functions as a high-security fence around the financial systems of West and Central Africa, ensuring that the wealth generated within those borders can be easily extracted and converted into euros, while the local populations remain trapped in a low-growth, high-unemployment equilibrium. The global trade architecture is often presented as a neutral framework designed to facilitate prosperity through comparative advantage. But for African nations, it functions as a sophisticated barrier to industrialization known as tariff escalation. This mechanism is a technical policy used by developed economies to ensure that African countries remain trapped at the bottom of the value chain as primary resource exporters. The operational logic is simple yet devastating. Raw materials are allowed into global markets with zero or near-zero tariffs. But as soon as a country attempts to process those materials, adding value and creating local jobs, the import duties in developed markets spike exponentially. This creates a systemic disincentive for any African nation to build its own factories or refine its own resources. If a nation exports raw cocoa beans to Europe, it faces no trade barriers. However, if that same nation attempts to roast the beans, grind them, and package them as chocolate bars, it is met with prohibitive tariffs that make its finished product uncompetitive against European-made brands. This taxation of complexity ensures that the industrial transformation, which is the historical engine of wealth creation, is effectively outlawed for the African continent. The implications are structural and multi-generational. By forcing African economies to stay in the extraction phase, the global trade system denies them the opportunity to develop a skilled manufacturing workforce or a diversified economic base. This maintains a state of commodity dependency, where national budgets are at the mercy of volatile global market prices for raw materials. When the price of oil or copper drops, the entire economy of the exporting nation collapses because they have no value-added industries to buffer the shock. This is not a failure of the market, but a deliberate design choice within international trade agreements that protects the industrial monopolies of the global north while relegating Africa to the role of a perpetual plantation. Furthermore, the technical implementation of these tariffs is often hidden behind non-tariff barriers, such as overly stringent sanitary regulations or complex rules of origin that are nearly impossible for small African enterprises to navigate. These layers of bureaucracy serve as a secondary wall, ensuring that even if a nation manages to lower its production costs, it is still blocked from entering the lucrative consumer markets of the West. The result is a forced underdevelopment where African nations are essentially paid to stay poor, providing the cheap inputs that fuel the high-tech industries and luxury markets of other continents. The math of tariff escalation reveals a systemic ceiling. No matter how hard an African nation works or how much aid it receives, it cannot grow as long as the rules of trade are designed to punish the very act of industrial progress. While illicit flows drain the front end of the economy, the back end is exploited through a predatory legal mechanism known as Vulture Fund litigation. These are private equity firms that specialize in a highly technical and aggressive form of debt arbitrage. The operational process begins when an African nation, often already struggling under the weight of historical debt and economic shocks, finds itself on the verge of default. While mainstream creditors might be willing to negotiate a debt restructuring to help the country recover, vulture funds move in to buy that distressed debt on the secondary market for a fraction of its face value, sometimes as low as 10 cents on the dollar. However, instead of participating in restructuring negotiations, these funds sue the sovereign state in international courts, such as those in New York or London, demanding the full original value of the debt plus decades of accumulated interest and legal fees. This creates a debt-to-litigation pipeline that bypasses national sovereignty and drains the meager fiscal reserves of developing nations. The technical leverage these funds use is often based on pari passu clauses in old bond contracts, which they interpret through aggressive litigation to block a country's ability to pay any other creditors until the vulture fund is paid in full. This effectively holds the entire national economy hostage. For a small African nation, a single legal judgment from a vulture fund can represent a double-digit percentage of its annual GDP. This is money that is directly diverted from public health, education, and infrastructure to the offshore accounts of hedge fund managers. The systemic cruelty of this mechanism is that it targets nations at their most vulnerable moment, turning a financial crisis into a permanent transfer of wealth from the poorest citizens to the wealthiest investors. The broader implication of this predatory behavior is the destruction of policy space for African governments. When a significant portion of a nation's revenue is earmarked for servicing litigated debt, the state loses its ability to respond to internal crises or invest in its future. This is the ultimate sovereign trap. Unlike corporations, nations cannot simply declare bankruptcy and start over. They're perpetually tethered to these predatory claims through a global legal system that prioritizes the sanctity of contract over the survival of human beings. The presence of vulture funds in the African debt market serves as a warning to any nation that attempts to prioritize its own people over international capital. It is a cold, calculated mechanism of enforcement that ensures African nations remain compliant and indebted, perpetually working to pay off the interest on a history they were never allowed to escape. The modern landscape of African development is increasingly dominated by a new model of engagement known as the Resource for Infrastructure, RFI swap. This operational framework, pioneered largely by emerging global powers and adopted in various forms by Western entities, presents a transactional alternative to traditional aid. Under an RFI agreement, a foreign entity, often a state-backed corporation, provides a capital, labor, and technology to build critical infrastructure such as railways, ports, or power plants. In exchange, the host African nation grants long-term extraction rights to its natural resources or uses those resources as collateral for the loan. While this model bypasses the bureaucratic hurdles of international financial institutions, it creates a technical form of asset-backed dependency. The infrastructure is frequently built using foreign materials and labor, ensuring that the initial capital investment immediately flows back to the lending country. While the African nation is left with a physical asset, it may not have the technical capacity to maintain and a massive debt obligation secured by its most valuable future exports. This mechanism introduces a new layer of technological lock-in. Because the infrastructure is built to the technical standards of a lending nation, the host country becomes permanently tethered to that nation for spare parts, software updates, and engineering expertise. This is not just a financial debt. It is a structural one. If a nation defaults on these payments, the collateral clauses within these contracts allow the lender to seize control of the asset itself, a process known as debt trap diplomacy. We have seen instances where strategic ports and critical energy grids have effectively been transferred to foreign control because a nation could not meet the repayment schedule dictated by fluctuating commodity prices. This creates a cycle where the very tools meant to facilitate development become the instruments of sovereign erosion, ensuring that the continent's physical connectivity remains subservient to the strategic interests of external powers. Furthermore, the systemic implication of these infrastructure projects is often the reinforcement of the extraction corridors. Most of these railways and roads are not designed to connect African cities to one another or to foster internal markets. They're engineered as straight lines from the mines and oil fields to the deepwater ports. This physical layout mirrors the economic architecture we have discussed. It is a system optimized for export, not for domestic integration. By prioritizing these corridors, the global system ensures that Africa's internal logistics remain fragmented while its external drainage remains highly efficient. The infrastructure itself becomes a physical manifestation of the structural extraction trap, where every mile of new track is designed to accelerate the outflow of wealth, leaving the host nation with a bill and a map that leads everywhere except toward its own industrial future. When we aggregate these mechanisms, the illicit financial flows, the monetary constraints of the CFA Franc, the trade barriers of tariff escalation, the predatory litigation of Vulture Funds, and the debt-backed infrastructure projects, a clear, unified picture emerges. This is not a series of unfortunate events or a catalog of local failures. It is a coherent, self-reinforcing global architecture. Each component functions as a gear in a massive machine designed to maintain a dynamic equilibrium of poverty. The system is designed to allow just enough stability for extraction to continue, but not enough capital accumulation for the continent to achieve true economic independence. This is the math of the Dreno Systemico, where the primary role of the African continent in the global hierarchy is to provide the raw inputs for the fourth industrial revolution while being systematically denied the means to participate in it. The global banking system acts as the central nervous system for this extraction. Through a network of offshore havens and complex legal frameworks, it facilitates the movement of capital from the poorest regions to the wealthiest, often under the guise of efficiency or market liquidity. The irony is profound. While international institutions lecture African nations on the need for transparency and good governance, the global financial architecture provides the very tools: shell companies, opaque transfer pricing, and predatory bond contracts that make transparency impossible. The poverty we see in Africa is not a lack of resources, but a lack of systemic sovereignty. It is the result of a rigged game where the rules are written by the creditors and enforced by the very institutions that claim to be working toward a world without poverty. The numbers reveal that the continent is a net creditor to the world. The development narrative is merely the PR department for a global operation of wealth harvesting. Breaking this cycle requires more than just better leadership or increased aid. It requires a fundamental systemic decoupling. The emergence of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, represents the most significant attempt to date to rewrite the rules from within. By creating a unified internal market, African nations aim to bypass the tariff escalation of the global north and foster the value-added industries that have been suppressed for centuries. If Africa can trade with itself, it can begin to build the industrial base necessary to process its own resources, keeping the wealth and the jobs within its own borders. However, the path to decoupling is fraught with technical challenges, as it directly threatens the interests of the global entities that profit from the current extraction model. The ultimate realization of our investigation is cold and clinical. African poverty is not an accident. It is a functional subproduct of the current global economic order. For the skyscrapers of London, New York, and Shanghai to gleam, the mines of the Congo and the oil fields of Nigeria must remain under the thumb of an architecture that prioritizes capital flow over human development. To change the outcome, one must change the math. Until the continent achieves monetary sovereignty, industrial protection, and a unified legal front against predatory capital, it will remain trapped in the resource curse by design. The future of Africa depends on its ability to stop being the world's silent donor and to start demanding a new set of numbers, ones that finally add up in its own favor.